Welcome to History and Ashes, the place where you and I dig into the dustiest corners of the past and find the stories that shaped the world you live in. Tonight, you are not just listening to history, you are stepping straight into one of its darkest, most unsettling moments. Imagine this. In less than 10 years, more than half of Europe's population would vanish. Entire villages were left empty, fields overgrown, and church bells rang so often for funerals that the sound became the background music of everyday life. The Black Death, as history now calls it, was not a single disaster, but a rolling storm of death and fear that swept across continents. It was a plague that moved silently on the backs of fleas and rats, carried by unsuspecting merchants, sailors, and travellers, striking towns and cities before anyone could even guess what was coming. There were stories of people who went to bed feeling healthy and never woke up again, their bodies claimed by a disease no one understood. Before we dive too far, can I ask you something? Go down to the comments and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Are you hiding under a blanket at midnight or listening while the sun is just coming up? And while you're there, if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and do it. Think of it like wearing a medieval plague mask. It might not save you from the buboes, but it will protect this channel from extinction. Picture yourself in the year 1347. You are standing at a bustling port somewhere along the Mediterranean coast. The air is salty, heavy with the smell of fish and spices from distant lands. Ships creak in the harbour, their sails snapping in the wind. They are filled with cargo, grain, silk, exotic goods, and, though no one can see it, death itself. Somewhere below deck, in the warm, dark corners of the hold, black rats scurry over ropes and wooden beams, their fleas jumping from one to another, carrying a microscopic killer. You hear the chatter of merchants negotiating prices, sailors shouting to one another, and perhaps you think the world is thriving. That trade is bringing prosperity. What you cannot see is that this moment marks the beginning of a catastrophe that will unravel everything you know about how life is supposed to work. The first signs are easy to miss. A sailor falls ill with a fever, and then a dock worker collapses a few days later. People whisper that perhaps it is bad air, or a punishment from God, but most carry on with their business. There have always been illnesses, after all, but soon you notice that the sickness spreads faster than any ordinary fever. The unlucky ones develop strange swellings, large and dark, in the armpits and groin, the dreaded buboes that give the disease its name. They burn with fever, their skin mottles and turns black in patches, and within a day or two, most are dead. There is no cure, no priestly blessing that can keep death from knocking on the door. The streets begin to change. Where once there was the smell of bread and fish and sweat, now the air reeks of sickness and fear. People start to avoid each other, keeping distance as though eye contact itself might carry the disease. Bodies are loaded into carts and wheeled away, sometimes by the very few who are still strong enough to do the grim work. Funerals become brief, hurried affairs. There are too many dead and not enough living to bury them. Even the priests grow scarce, some dying of the plague themselves, others fleeing in terror. If you were there, you might notice a strange silence creeping in between the sound of the church bells. Markets that were once crowded now have fewer stalls. Ships stop arriving, or worse, they arrive with no one left alive aboard. The rhythm of daily life begins to break down. You might start to feel that the world itself is coming apart, that perhaps Judgment Day is at hand. And who could blame you? When every neighbour, friend, and family member seems to fall one after another, and no doctor or priest can explain why, what else could it mean? There were those who tried to leave, packing what they could and heading for the countryside, hoping the open air would keep them safe. Some cities shut their gates, refusing entry to travelers in an attempt to keep the pestilence out. But the plague was already inside. It moved faster than any wall could contain, carried by invisible fleas that jumped from person to person, from town to town, the very movement of goods and people. The lifeblood of the medieval world became the thing that spread death further. And yet, in all this, there were moments that would make you stop and stare. A family might be wiped out except for one lone survivor, who then had to decide what to do with the bodies of their kin. A village might be left entirely empty, its doors swinging open in the wind, its hearths cold, as if everyone had simply vanished. Some cities saw death rates so high that there were not enough living to bury the dead. In these places, bodies were thrown into hastily dug pits, layer upon layer, covered with lime and earth. As you listen to this, imagine how small and fragile life must have felt. Imagine lying awake at night, wondering if that tickle in your throat meant you had only days left to live. How would you have reacted? Would you have prayed harder, confessed your sins, and sought forgiveness? Or would you have given up entirely, deciding that if death was certain, you might as well live recklessly until it came? The Black Death did not just kill, it reshaped the very fabric of society. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we explore the way it tore down the old order and created something new, we need to understand just how far it spread and why it was able to strike so quickly and so violently. So here is the question to think about before we go further. If you were standing in that harbour in 1347, would you have seen the danger in time, or would you have been among the first to fall? To understand how the Black Death consumed so much of the known world, you have to follow the path it took, not just across Europe, but across thousands of miles of trade routes that linked entire civilizations. You might imagine the plague suddenly appearing in Europe one day, but its story begins far earlier, in the dry grasslands of Central Asia. Somewhere in the steppe, the bacterium Yersinia pestis lived quietly inside rodent populations for centuries. These animals had coexisted with the disease long enough to develop resistance. It was only when the bacteria found a way into the flea-rat-human chain that it became something far more catastrophic. Think of the Silk Road, a spider web of paths connecting China to the Middle East, Persia, and beyond. This was the highway of the medieval world, carrying silk, spices, furs, and silver. But it also carried death. The Mongol Empire, which at this time stretched across much of Eurasia, made these routes safer than ever before. Merchants could travel farther and faster under the protection of Mongol rule, bringing prosperity and trade to cities that had once been remote. Ironically, that same safety and efficiency turned into the perfect network for a pandemic. Fleas infested grain stores, hitched rides on camels and horses, and eventually found their way to human settlements, spreading the disease step by step. By the early 1340s, the plague had appeared in several regions of Asia, striking trade towns and caravanserais along the way. Chroniclers in China recorded devastating outbreaks where entire communities were reported to have perished. In some provinces, they said 9 out of 10 people died. Though such numbers are hard to verify, they speak to the scale of the disaster. The disease then moved westward, likely following caravans along the Silk Road until it reached the Crimean port city of Kaffa, a Genoese trading colony on the Black Sea. Here, history gives us one of its most chilling stories. In 1346, Kaffa was besieged by a Mongol army. The attackers themselves were struck by the plague, and as their numbers fell, they supposedly turned to a grim tactic. They catapulted the bodies of their dead over the city walls, hoping to infect those inside. Whether this was the first instance of biological warfare or just a legend, the outcome was the same. The plague spread inside the city, and soon the Genoese fled by ship, heading back to Italy. Without knowing it, they carried the plague with them, and with each harbour they stopped at along the way, they left death behind. By the autumn of 1347, the first reports of plague reached Sicily. Imagine being a dock worker there. You see the ships pulling in, you smell the usual cargo of grain, but soon you notice that many of the sailors are already sick or dead. Before long, the disease leaps ashore. Palermo, Messina, and other coastal cities are overwhelmed. Attempts to contain it fail because no one understands what they are dealing with. The illness spreads inland, carried by travellers, pilgrims, merchants, even by the rats that followed human settlements everywhere they went. Within months, the plague is in Genoa, Venice, Pisa, and Marseille. By the next year, it is in Paris and London. Think about that speed for a moment. In an age when most people travelled by foot or cart, a disease managed to sweep across entire countries in just a few seasons. It did not discriminate between rich and poor, between city and countryside. If there were people, there were rats. And if there were rats, there were fleas. That was all the plague needed. Daily life began to look like a slow-motion collapse. Travellers arriving from infected areas were sometimes turned away or even killed to stop the spread. Early, desperate attempts at quarantine. Some towns posted guards at the gates, others built bonfires to purify the air, believing the smoke might drive away the pestilence. And yet, it kept coming. It is hard to overstate the helplessness people must have felt. You could not predict who would fall sick next. Perhaps the baker on your street died yesterday, and tomorrow it might be the priest or the local magistrate. Mothers saw their children struck down, entire families disappeared overnight. For those watching, the world must have felt as though it was unravelling, like a cloth that had been worn too thin, finally tearing apart. The disease did not just move through cities, it also reached the countryside. Peasants working in the fields were not spared. Some manors were left without enough workers to harvest crops. Entire villages were abandoned. It was not uncommon for travellers to come across settlements that looked perfectly normal from the outside but were silent, every inhabitant dead or fled. If you close your eyes and imagine standing on one of these trade routes, you might see a caravan approaching, hear the bells on the camels' necks, and smell the dust rising from their hooves. But now you know that hidden in their packs, in the folds of their clothing, in the fur of their animals, is an invisible passenger that will transform the continent. And yet, none of the people you see are aware of it. They smile, bargain, tell stories by the campfire. Death is walking beside them, and they do not even know it. The spread of the Black Death reminds you how connected the medieval world really was. Much more than we sometimes think. And it raises an unsettling question. If you had lived in one of these cities, would you have trusted the rumours of a mysterious sickness enough to pack up and leave? Or would you have stayed, convincing yourself that it was just another fever, hoping it would pass? The plague has now arrived in your town, and the rhythm of life you once knew is broken. The streets are quieter, but the silence is not peaceful. It is heavy, tense, the kind of quiet where you hear every distant cough and shudder. Somewhere a dog barks, somewhere a cart creaks, but even the animals seem to sense that something is wrong. You wake in the morning to the sound of church bells, not for mass, but for death. They toll again at noon, again at dusk. In some towns, they ring so often that eventually they stop altogether because there are no bell ringers left. The sound of mourning becomes so constant that it fades into the background. like the ticking of a clock. Walking through the marketplace, you notice it is half empty. Some stalls are abandoned, their owners either sick, dead, or fled. Prices for food climb higher by the day because there are fewer farmers, fewer bakers, fewer butchers bringing goods to sell. The air is thick with the smell of smoke. Towns burn herbs, juniper, rosemary, or simply anything that can make the air smell better, hoping that pleasant scents might drive away the bad air thought to carry the plague. Neighbors avoid each other now. A friend you have known for years might cross to the other side of the street if they see you coming, not out of rudeness, but out of fear. Parents begin to keep their children inside. Some people stop going to church altogether, afraid of catching the plague in the crowded pews. Others do the opposite. They go more often, praying desperately for protection. Inside homes, life becomes strangely quiet. Meals grow smaller as food becomes scarce. The sick are sometimes shut in separate rooms, and their families wait in fear, listening for the sounds of coughing or crying from behind the door. When the buboes swell, there is little to be done but wait. Medieval medicine offers few remedies, perhaps a bleeding, a poultice, or a prayer, but none of it seems to help. The unlucky suffer fevers so high that they rave and hallucinate, and then they die, leaving their families to figure out what to do with the body. Some towns attempt to keep up the routine of life. Markets still open, courts still hold trials, and priests still preach sermons. But the pressure is immense. In some places, officials resort to locking the sick in their homes to contain the disease, nailing the doors shut and leaving food outside if they have enough to spare. The healthy are told to keep their distance, but how far can you really stay away in a cramped medieval street where homes are only a few feet apart and sewage runs in the gutters? Religion is everywhere. You see processions of priests carrying relics, praying for divine mercy. People join these marches barefoot, some whipping themselves as they go. These are the flagellants, who believe that punishing their own flesh might convince God to spare the rest of the world. In many places, they become a common sight. Men walking from town to town, singing hymns, chanting prayers, and striking their backs until they bleed. But fear also leads to darker things. In many towns, rumors begin to spread that someone must be to blame. Strangers are suspected first. Foreigners, beggars, even travelers are accused of poisoning wells or spreading the sickness deliberately. Jewish communities, already living on the margins of medieval society, become easy scapegoats. Some towns expel them, others slaughter them outright. Entire neighborhoods are burned. This is one of the ugliest truths of the plague years, that fear drove people not only to prayer but also to persecution. And yet, amid all this terror, life does not stop completely. People still fall in love, children are still born, neighbors still share food if they have any to spare. You might see a mother coaxing her child to eat, or a father repairing a fence, even with the world falling apart around him. In some places, musicians still play, perhaps thinking that if death is coming anyway, they may as well fill the air with song. Daily survival becomes an art. You wash more often, not because you know about germs, no one does yet, but because it feels safer. You keep away from strangers. You watch the wind, wondering which direction it is blowing, trying to guess if it will bring sickness to your street. Every decision becomes a calculation. Do you risk going to the well for water or wait another day? Do you open the door to a traveller who knocks or pretend you are not home? The smell of death begins to follow you everywhere. In the narrow streets, carts carry away bodies, sometimes piled high. The sound of the wheels against the stones becomes unforgettable. There are too many dead for ordinary burials. Graves are dug hastily, wide pits where dozens of bodies are laid together. In some places, they are sprinkled with lime to keep down the stench before more earth is thrown on top. And still, life goes on, because it must. You wake up each morning unsure if you will live to see the night, but you still must eat, still must fetch water, still must find firewood to keep warm. That strange mixture of terror and routine defines the plague years, the sense that everything is collapsing, but also the quiet stubbornness of ordinary people refusing to give up completely. So as you stand in that street, with the smell of smoke and sickness in the air, what would you have done? Would you have joined the prayers and processions begging for mercy? Would you have shut yourself inside and waited it out? Or would you have fled, leaving everything you knew behind in the hope that the countryside might spare you? You cannot truly understand the Black Death until you face its numbers, though they are almost too large to believe. By the time the first great wave of plague had passed, somewhere between a third and a half of Europe's population was gone. Imagine half of every person you know simply vanishing within a few short years. Entire families disappeared from the records. Some villages were left with no one at all. The church registers go silent, the fields grow wild, and the only witnesses are the crows circling overhead. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a burial pit. It is wide enough to hold dozens of bodies, and the air smells of earth and lime and decay. Men work quickly because there are more bodies coming every day. There is no time for individual prayers. In many places, the dead are simply stacked layer upon layer, a sheet of earth between each row until the pit is full and must be sealed. The living stand a few feet away, some crossing themselves, some weeping, some staring blankly as though they have seen so much death that they can no longer feel anything at all. Death becomes so common that people grow numb to it. You might see a man step over the body of a stranger in the street without pausing, because stopping would not change anything. In some towns, carts roll through shouting for the living to bring out their dead. The dead are collected like refuse, taken to the pits outside the walls, dumped quickly so that the collectors can move on before they fall sick too. The physical signs of plague are unforgettable. Buboes swell until they burst, black patches spread across the skin, and the smell of sickness clings to everything. Chroniclers wrote of people vomiting blood, of entire households struck down in a single night. Some said the sickness could kill within 3 days, others that it was faster. Whether or not those reports are exact, the impression they leave is the same. Death was sudden, cruel, and unstoppable. The toll is not only physical, but mental. The survivors are haunted, not just by the faces of those they buried, but by the randomness of it all. Why did one person live while another, sleeping in the same bed, died? People search for answers in the stars, in the wind, in the judgments of heaven. Some decide that the world must be ending, that this is the apocalypse foretold in Scripture. Others lose faith entirely, believing that if God allows such suffering, perhaps he is no longer watching. Children grow up in a world where death is everywhere. They learn too soon how to dig graves, how to carry bodies, how to live with loss. Widows and widowers become common. Young people inherit lands and houses long before their time because there is no one else left to claim them. The structure of families breaks apart. Cousins are raised by strangers. Servants suddenly become masters of estates because the lord and his heirs are dead. The fear seeps into every decision. You might think twice before visiting a neighbor, before sharing a cup, before touching a door latch. You might burn incense in your home or carry a sachet of herbs around your neck, hoping the smell will keep the plague away. When you do step outside, you may cover your face with a cloth soaked in vinegar, not because it works, but because it gives you something to believe in. For some, the constant presence of death drives them to despair. Chroniclers wrote of people who abandoned their loved ones, even their children, choosing to save themselves rather than stay and risk infection. Others turned to drink or to pleasure, deciding that since tomorrow was uncertain, they would fill today with whatever joy they could find. There are also stories of incredible courage. Priests and nuns tending to the sick even when they knew it might kill them. Grave diggers who kept working long after everyone else had fled because someone had to do it. Neighbors who shared food with those trapped in their houses, knowing that it might bring the sickness to their own door. The psychological weight of those years was so great that it left a mark on an entire generation. Art from the years after the plague is filled with images of skeletons, of dancing death, of reminders that life is short and fragile. The memory of what people saw could not be erased, and in many ways it reshaped how they thought about the world. As you imagine standing there, watching the cart roll past with its grim cargo, consider how you would have coped. Would you have found comfort in faith, or would you have grown hard and numb to survive? Would you have run from your town at the first sign of sickness, or stayed to care for those who could not care for themselves? When so many lives are lost so quickly, society does not simply mourn, it breaks. The Black Death did not just take people, it took the workers, the farmers, the craftsmen, the merchants, the very hands that kept the medieval world turning. The result was an economic collapse that rippled through every village, every city, every kingdom. Picture a field in late summer. The wheat is ready for harvest, but no one is there to cut it. The few peasants who survived in the area cannot do the work alone. The grain rots where it stands, and the next year, famine adds to the suffering. Lords look out over their manors and realize that half of their tenants are gone, that rents will not be paid, that there are not enough hands to work the land. This scarcity of labor creates something unprecedented, bargaining power for the survivors. In many places, peasants begin to demand higher wages, shorter hours, or better conditions. Some even leave their manors entirely, moving to other towns where they can earn more. The old system of feudal obligation, where peasants owed service to their lord, begins to fray. But the ruling classes do not like this new reality. Kings and lords try to pass laws to freeze wages at their old levels, to stop peasants from leaving the land. In England, for example, the Statute of Labourers is passed in 1351, attempting to fix wages and keep society as it was before. But you cannot legislate away a plague. The population is simply too small to do the same amount of work, and wages keep rising despite the laws. Cities face their own struggles, markets are disrupted, guilds lose members, and some trades nearly vanish. Luxury goods become harder to find, not just because of trade disruption, but because there are fewer people who can afford them. At the same time, new opportunities open for those who survive. If you were a poor labourer before, you might suddenly find yourself in demand, able to earn more than ever. If you were a woman, you might find yourself managing property or businesses that once belonged to your deceased husband or father. Wealth changes hands quickly. With so many heirs dead, land and goods are passed on to distant relatives, or sometimes seized by the crown or the church. This redistribution of property, combined with the labour shortage, begins to slowly erode the rigid class divisions of the medieval world. Over time, this will help lay the groundwork for a different kind of society, one that will eventually give birth to new political movements and, centuries later, revolutions. The psychological shift is just as important as the economic one. People who have lived through such devastation do not see the world the same way. They know that life is short, fragile, unpredictable. This leads some to a more religious life, dedicating themselves to prayer and charity. Others turn toward material pleasures, building bigger houses, wearing finer clothes, eating better food, because they want to enjoy the time they have. Now, before we go further, if you are still here with me and you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. Because if you do not, this channel may end up like a deserted medieval village, silent, abandoned, and slowly reclaimed by weeds. Subscribing is your way of ringing the bell to let us know you're still alive and want us to keep making history for you. Back in the plague years, the church also faced a crisis. So many priests died that there were not enough left to perform mass, baptize infants, or hear confessions. The clergy that remained sometimes demanded higher fees or were replaced by younger, less experienced men. This weakened the authority of the church in the eyes of many as people began to question why God had allowed such suffering and why his representatives had failed to protect them. Guilds, the organizations that controlled crafts and trades, also suffered heavy losses. In some towns, entire guilds were left with only a handful of members. This forced them to lower requirements for apprenticeships, allowing new people in just to keep the trade alive. It was a strange mixture of tragedy and opportunity. The world was full of empty houses, empty shops, empty fields, and yet, for those who survived, there was space to rise, to claim something new. The social order is no longer as stable as it was before the plague. There are riots and uprisings in the years that follow, as peasants push for their new freedoms and resent efforts to drag them back into the old ways. The memory of the plague years fuels this unrest, because everyone remembers that death does not care about kings or lords or priests, and that knowledge changes how people think about power. As you stand there, looking out over a half-empty village or a market where the faces are fewer but the coins are flowing faster, you cannot help but wonder what the future will look like. Will society return to its old order, or will this new balance of power lead to something entirely different? When the plague strikes so suddenly and so mercilessly, the first question everyone asks is why? In a world where religion shapes nearly every aspect of life, the answer many turn to is simple. This must be the punishment of God. It is not just sickness, it is judgment. Imagine walking into a cathedral in the year 1348. The air is thick with incense, candles flicker, and the sound of prayers echoes from every corner. The pews are full of people begging for mercy, weeping, promising to live better lives if only the plague will pass them by. Some carry little wax figures representing their sick relatives and place them before the altar. Others crawl on their knees, believing that acts of humility will earn divine protection. Priests preach sermons about sin, warning that the world has grown corrupt and that this plague is a cleansing fire. Confession lines stretch out the door as people rush to have their sins forgiven before death claims them. The churches are busy until they are empty, because the priests themselves are dying too. In some towns, half of the clergy are gone, leaving parishes without mass, without last rites, without any sense of spiritual order. This spiritual vacuum opens the door for new movements. One of the most striking is the rise of the flagellants, groups of men who travel from town to town, beating themselves with whips tipped with iron or bone. They believe that if they suffer enough, they can take on the sins of the world and end the plague. Crowds gather to watch them march through the streets, chanting hymns, their backs raw and bloody. For some, they are living saints. For others, they are unsettling, even dangerous, as their processions often turn chaotic and spread panic rather than peace. Not all responses are religious. Some people lose faith entirely. They stop going to church, stop praying, and turn instead to earthly pleasures. Chroniclers wrote of people who ate, drank, and were merry, determined to enjoy what time they had left. This divide between those who became more devout and those who turned away is one of the lasting scars of the Black Death. And then there is the search for someone to blame. Fear looks for a target. It is easier to believe that someone is causing the plague than to accept that it is invisible and unstoppable. Whispers spread that Jews have poisoned the wells, that strangers are carrying cursed powders, that witches or heretics are working with the devil to bring ruin on Christendom. The consequences are horrific. In city after city, Jewish communities are attacked. Some are expelled, others massacred. In Strasbourg in 1349, hundreds of Jewish men, women, and children are burned alive after being accused of causing the plague. Those who survive flee, moving eastward into Poland and Lithuania, where they are given refuge by rulers willing to protect them. This forced migration will permanently reshape the map of Jewish life in Europe. Even lepers, who have lived on the margins of society for generations, are accused and killed in some places. It is as if fear has loosened all the restraints of ordinary morality. People are desperate for control, and if control means purging the guilty, then they are willing to do it. But there are also those who resist this tide of violence. Some rulers issue orders protecting their Jewish subjects, threatening punishment for anyone who harms them. Some towns refuse to let the flagellants enter, fearing they will only stir up more unrest. In this way, the plague becomes a test not just of survival, but of justice, of whether communities will give in to fear or hold fast to reason. This crisis of faith and morality is one of the most fascinating parts of the Black Death's legacy. It shows you that when disaster strikes, humanity does not react in just one way. Some grow kinder, others crueler. Some turn upward to heaven, others inward to themselves. The plague becomes not just a physical challenge, but a spiritual one, shaping the hearts of those who lived through it. As you picture yourself in that cathedral, hearing the mutter of prayers and the distant toll of bells, ask yourself, would you have joined the flagellants, whipping yourself through the streets? Would you have accused the strangers at the edge of town, or stood up to protect them? Or would you have given up on faith altogether, deciding that if the world is this cruel, perhaps there is no justice at all? By now, the plague has become a familiar shadow, and with it comes the question that haunts everyone: how do you stop it? In the 14th century, medicine is a mixture of observation, tradition, astrology, and guesswork. The great medical texts come from the works of Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna, scholars who believed that the body was ruled by four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness, they taught, was caused by an imbalance of these humours, and the key to health was restoring the balance. So when the plague strikes, physicians first turn to what they know. They prescribe bloodletting, cutting a vein to let out bad blood. They apply leeches, cupping glasses, or heated knives. If the patient survives, perhaps the balance is restored. If they die, well, it was God's will. Others try purging with laxatives or emetics, forcing the body to vomit or expel its contents in hopes of flushing out the poison. Then there are the poultices, mixtures of herbs, flowers, and even ground gemstones, pressed onto the swelling buboes to draw out the infection. Some recipes call for strange ingredients: crushed emeralds, mercury, arsenic, or even the flesh of snakes. One physician recommends bathing in vinegar or rose water. Another suggests applying dried toad to the sores until it swells with the poison and falls off. None of it works. But in an age when there is no concept of bacteria, every attempt feels worth trying. Physicians also look to the stars. Astrology is considered a respectable science, and many medical texts attribute the plague to a conjunction of planets. Some chroniclers write that the alignment of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345 poisoned the air, sending noxious vapours down to Earth. If the stars caused it, perhaps the cure lies in timing bloodletting or purges according to the movements of the heavens. The idea of bad air, or miasma, becomes central to prevention. People carry posies of flowers, pomanders filled with spices, or sachets of herbs to keep the air around them sweet. In some towns, fires are lit in public squares to cleanse the air, and in others, gunpowder or incense is burned to create smoke believed to drive away the plague. The rich might retreat to their country estates, believing the open air to be safer than the crowded streets. And then there is the mask, perhaps the most famous image of plague medicine. By the later outbreaks of plague in the 17th century, doctors begin wearing the long bird-beaked masks stuffed with herbs, which we now see as a symbol of the time. In the 14th century, the practice is less common, but the idea is the same: to filter the air through pleasant-smelling substances. A physician might walk the streets with a wand or stick, using it to point to patients or lift their clothing without touching them. Quarantine emerges as one of the few measures that actually works, though no one yet understands why. In Venice, a city that thrives on trade, officials realize that they must act or risk losing everything. They create lazarettos, isolated islands where arriving sailors and cargo are held for 40 days before being allowed into the city. The word quarantine comes from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. This is one of the first systematic attempts at public health, and while imperfect, it does slow the spread of disease. Other cities adopt similar measures. Houses where someone has died may be sealed, the inhabitants forced to stay inside for weeks. Travellers may be required to carry health certificates, proving they come from a town free of plague. In some regions, entire villages are surrounded by guards, allowing no one in or out until the sickness passes. These measures are harsh and often cruel, but they mark the beginning of an understanding that human behavior can influence the course of an epidemic. Medicine also becomes a matter of prayer. Physicians often combine their treatments with blessings or charms. Amulets inscribed with prayers are worn around the neck. Holy relics are brought out and paraded through the streets. Pilgrimages are organized, though ironically these gatherings often spread the plague even further. Not everyone trusts the physicians. Their expensive remedies often fail, and so people turn to folk healers, wise women, or midwives. These women use charms, herbal brews, or simple comfort, washing the sores, cooling the fevered brow. Sometimes their care is more effective than the bleeding and purging of university-trained doctors, though they rarely receive credit for it. Some towns become laboratories of desperation. Chroniclers tell of people who drink vinegar and garlic wine daily, believing it will keep the plague away. Others rub onions, salt, or even human waste onto their skin as a preventative. In a few places, pigs are slaughtered and their fat spread over doorways because someone claims it worked in another village. If you can imagine it, someone probably tried it. Even music is thought to be a cure. In some regions, musicians are hired to play in the streets, to lighten the mood and perhaps drive away the evil spirits. The sound of lutes, fiddles and drums becomes part of the city's soundtrack, competing with the bells tolling for the dead. And yet, despite all these efforts, the plague does not stop. It burns through town after town, mocking the ingenuity of humankind. Doctors write treatises, chroniclers take notes, but no cure is found. For those living through it, the failure of medicine is as terrifying as the disease itself. If the most learned men in Christendom cannot stop this, then perhaps nothing can. But in this grim time, something important happens. People begin to observe more carefully. They notice that the sick infect those who come too close. They notice that isolating a household sometimes prevents others from falling ill. These are the first small steps toward an understanding of contagion, steps that will one day lead to the birth of modern epidemiology. Imagine yourself in that moment, with a choice to make. The city physician offers to lance your buboes with a heated knife, a procedure as painful as it sounds. The wise woman offers a poultice of herbs and prayer. Or perhaps you choose to flee to the countryside, hoping the clean air will spare you. Which would you trust? Which risk would you take, knowing that one wrong move might mean death? When the first waves of the plague finally pass, the silence is almost as shocking as the death itself. The bells stop tolling. The carts that once rolled through the streets collecting bodies are gone. And you, somehow, are still alive. But survival is not as simple as waking up one morning to find the sickness gone. The world you step into is unrecognizable. In many towns, whole neighborhoods are empty. Fields lie fallow, not because of drought or war, but because there is simply no one left to work them. You might walk down a road that used to be bustling with merchants, beggars, and travelers, and find it eerily quiet, doors hanging open, weeds creeping over the cobblestones. The population of Europe has been cut by as much as 1/3, maybe even more, and that loss leaves a visible scar. But with catastrophe comes change, and for those who have survived, the world is suddenly full of possibilities. Labor is in short supply. Where once a serf had little choice but to work the same fields for the same lord at the same meagre wage, now those who survive can bargain. They can demand better pay, better conditions, even freedom from obligations that once bound them to the land. In some regions, wages double or triple. This shift creates tension. Landowners and kings do not want to lose their cheap labor, so they pass laws to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. In England, the Ordinance of Labourers of 1349 and the Statute of Labourers of 1351 are designed to force workers to accept the old wages and to keep them from leaving their villages. But people defy these laws, moving to new towns, seeking new masters, and making choices their grandparents could never have dreamed of. This is the beginning of something historians sometimes call the end of the Middle Ages. The rigid system of feudal obligations starts to crack. For a brief moment, it is as if the survivors hold the future in their hands. They have leverage and they use it. Some buy land, some start businesses, some send their children to school, hoping they will rise even higher. The plague also changes the way people think about death. It is no longer distant, no longer something you might face in old age. Death has walked through every street, sat at every table, taken neighbors and friends without warning. This creates a culture that is both grim and strangely vibrant. Art becomes filled with images of skeletons, decaying bodies, and dancing corpses. The famous Danse Macabre, the dance of death, reminding everyone that death spares no one, king or peasant, merchant or monk. But it is not all darkness. There is also an explosion of creativity and building. Cathedrals, hospitals, and universities are founded or expanded. Perhaps it is a way of giving thanks for survival, or perhaps it is a way of leaving a mark before death comes again. In some towns, processions and festivals are revived with even greater energy, as if life must be celebrated twice as loudly now that it has proven so fragile. For families, survival means starting over. Children are married younger, not just to ensure heirs, but to rebuild communities as quickly as possible. Widows remarry, sometimes gaining wealth and independence they never would have had if their first husbands had lived. Whole new lineages begin in the wake of the plague. Food becomes more plentiful for the survivors. With fewer mouths to feed, there is more grain, more meat, more fish for each person. Diets improve, and for some, life is actually healthier in the years after the plague than it was before. Chroniclers note that the poor are dressing in finer clothes, eating better bread, and even drinking better wine. And yet, the shadow of the plague does not vanish. The disease returns in cycles for decades to come. Some towns are hit again within a few years, and survivors must live with the constant fear that the bells will start tolling once more. This fear becomes a permanent part of life, shaping how people think about God, about luck, about the fragility of human plans. You can almost feel this tension in the chronicles written by those who lived through it. They speak of joy at being spared, but also of guilt. Guilt for surviving when so many did not. Guilt for taking advantage of opportunities created by death. Some write that the world will never be the same, that humanity has been forever changed by what it has endured. This is also a time when communities experiment with new ideas about public health. They build pest houses, early hospitals, to isolate the sick. They appoint officials to watch for signs of disease and enforce quarantines. They dig new cemeteries outside the city walls, creating more permanent spaces for the dead. These practical measures are a quiet but lasting legacy of the Black Death, shaping how Europe will handle epidemics for centuries to come. And here you are, standing in this half-empty world, wondering what comes next. Will there be another outbreak? Will life return to what it was before? Or has something irreversible happened, something that will carry the world toward a new future? One with freer peasants, richer merchants, and a different balance of power. There is something haunting about this moment in history, because it is both an ending and a beginning. The plague has wiped away millions of lives, but in doing so, it has cleared space for new ideas, new freedoms, new art, new science. This is not a story of death alone. It is a story of how humanity finds a way to keep going, even when it has been brought to its knees. So if you had lived through it, what would you have done with your second chance? Would you have stayed in your village, tending the same fields, grateful just to be alive? Or would you have taken to the road, seeking a better life in the cities, daring to build something new from the ashes of the old world? When enough years have passed that the plague is not just a daily terror, but a memory, Europe begins to look back at what has happened, and to wonder what it means. The devastation of the Black Death has changed not only who is alive, but how people think, how they worship, how they govern, and how they create. It is not an exaggeration to say that the world after the plague is a different world entirely. The first great change is economic. We talked before about how wages rose because of the labour shortage, but the ripple effects go even further. Land that had once been too expensive to own is now available for purchase. Whole estates pass into the hands of new families because the old lines have died out. This means wealth becomes more widely distributed, giving rise to a growing middle class, merchants, tradesmen, and skilled artisans who are not noble by birth but who have money and influence. This shift has political consequences. Kings and princes can no longer rely solely on the feudal system of lords and vassals to provide soldiers or revenue. Instead, they begin to turn to towns and cities for taxes and professional armies. Over time, this strengthens centralized monarchies and weakens the old feudal lords. The world is slowly moving toward the age of nation-states, though no one in the 14th century would have put it in those terms. The church, too, has been transformed. The plague killed so many priests and monks that it had to recruit quickly, and some of those brought in were poorly trained. This lowered standards and led to a loss of prestige. People begin to question whether the clergy truly have special power to protect or guide them. When the papacy relocates to Avignon during this era, and later splits during the Great Schism with multiple popes claiming authority, the result is a crisis of confidence in religious leadership. And yet, religion itself remains powerful. Pilgrimages grow more popular. People continue to fund the building of chapels and cathedrals, often as acts of thanksgiving for survival. But there is a subtle shift happening. Faith is becoming more personal, more inward. Lay people form confraternities, groups dedicated to prayer, charity, and care for the sick. The seeds of reform are being planted, seeds that will eventually grow into movements like the Protestant Reformation. Culturally, the plague opens the door for a new fascination with death, but also with life. The macabre imagery of skeletons and grim reapers becomes common, not just in church frescoes, but in popular plays and songs. The danse macabre becomes a recurring theme, reminding viewers that all must die, but also urging them to live well before that moment comes. This is the soil in which the Renaissance begins to grow. In Italy especially, the economic and demographic shifts free up resources for art, architecture, and scholarship. Families like the Medici in Florence use their wealth to sponsor painters, sculptors, and scholars. Libraries expand. Ancient Greek and Roman texts are rediscovered, translated, and studied. There is a new hunger for knowledge, as if surviving the plague has made humanity determined to understand the world more deeply. Science begins to edge away from purely religious explanations and toward observation. Physicians record detailed case studies of plague victims. City governments keep mortality statistics, comparing which neighborhoods are hit hardest. This habit of data collection, born of desperation, becomes a habit of curiosity, one that will later fuel the scientific revolution. Even art itself begins to change. Before the plague, medieval art often focused on stylized, symbolic images, but after the catastrophe, artists seem more interested in realism. Faces become more expressive, bodies more naturalistic. It is as if, having seen so much of life and death up close, artists want to capture it more faithfully. Education also benefits from this transformation. With so many clerical positions open, universities expand to train new priests, doctors, and administrators. Literacy begins to creep upward, not just among the elite, but among merchants and townspeople who need to keep records of contracts and trade. Knowledge is spreading, and with it, a sense that the world is not fixed but can be shaped. Politically, the plague sets the stage for rebellion as well. The attempts by kings to freeze wages and keep workers tied to the land lead to uprisings, like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, where thousands of commoners march on London demanding freedom from serfdom and fairer treatment. Though the revolt is crushed, the idea cannot be put back in the box. Over the coming centuries, serfdom gradually declines, and Europe becomes a society with more mobility and choice than before. On a global level, the plague's devastation shifts trade networks. Some routes decline as towns are abandoned, but others become even more important as survivors rebuild commerce. The demand for luxury goods like silk, spices, and gold increases, fueling voyages of exploration in the 15th century. The very ships that once carried the plague will soon carry explorers to Africa, Asia, and eventually the Americas, setting off a new era of contact and conquest. In literature, we see one of the clearest reflections of this new world in works like Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, a collection of stories told by young people who flee the plague-ridden city of Florence to wait it out in the countryside. Their tales are filled with humor, tragedy, love, and wit, a reminder that even in times of death, people still hunger for entertainment, for meaning, for connection. You can almost feel the world waking up from a nightmare. It is cautious, yes, but also hungry to live, to know, to build. It is a strange paradox. The Black Death was one of the deadliest disasters in human history, but it cleared away enough of the old order to make room for something new. Without it, the Renaissance might have come later, or differently. And as you sit here, listening, think about this strange truth. The world you live in today, with its cities, its sciences, its individual freedoms, is partly shaped by this great tragedy. The cost was unimaginable, but the transformation was real. It forces a difficult question. Would humanity have made these leaps without such a terrible push? Or is it sometimes only through fire and loss that new worlds are forged? As the centuries pass, the Black Death becomes more than just a series of outbreaks. It transforms into a story, a cautionary tale, a memory written into the bones of Europe. For you standing in the 15th century, looking back at the desolate villages, the empty streets, the cemeteries overflowing with bodies, it is impossible not to feel the weight of its legacy. The plague is no longer merely a medical event. It is a cultural, social, and psychological milestone, shaping the course of history in ways that echo across generations. First, there is the undeniable demographic impact. Entire towns were depopulated. Fields lay untended, forests reclaimed farmland, and towns shrank to fractions of their former size. The population collapse is staggering. Europe loses somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of its people. You can almost imagine walking down a street that used to be bustling, now lined with abandoned homes, their roofs caved in, their walls crumbling. The air is still, heavy, almost reverent in its silence. This absence is felt in every layer of society, in politics, in economics, in family life. With so many lives gone, labour becomes scarce, and the survivors are suddenly empowered in a way that was previously impossible. Peasants can demand higher wages, artisans can negotiate better terms, and even the lowliest merchant can find new opportunities. The old feudal hierarchies are strained, sometimes breaking entirely. A peasant who once had no choice but to work for a lord now considers moving to a nearby town where wages are higher. You can almost hear the murmurs in town halls. We survived. We can make our lives matter. This empowerment begins subtle but permanent shifts in the social structure of Europe. The economic effects are profound. With fewer people consuming, the demand for goods shifts, and prices fluctuate unpredictably. Land that had been too expensive to cultivate suddenly becomes available. Wealth consolidates in new hands. Families that survive inherit property from relatives who are gone. This redistribution of wealth creates pockets of opportunity and innovation that would have been impossible before the plague. You can see it in the rise of towns, in the growth of trade, in the first stirrings of what will eventually become modern capitalism. But the Black Death is not just a story of opportunity. It is a story of trauma, and trauma shapes human behaviour in ways that persist far beyond the event itself. People who survive live under a shadow of grief and guilt. They carry the memory of what was lost, parents, children, spouses, friends, and that memory informs every decision. Some retreat inward, becoming more devout, more cautious, more conservative. Others embrace life with a ferocity born of having stared into death and survived. You can see this duality reflected in the literature, art, and cultural expressions of the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. Art changes in direct response to the plague. The danse macabre, the dance of death, emerges as a popular motif, reminding people that death comes for all, rich or poor, young or old. Skeletons are depicted alongside kings, merchants, and peasants, often engaged in everyday activities, dancing or laughing. It is both macabre and strangely comforting, a recognition that death is inevitable, yes, but also a part of life that can be acknowledged, confronted, and even reflected upon with a measure of acceptance. Artists begin to depict emotions more vividly, faces more realistically, bodies with greater anatomical accuracy. This focus on realism and human experience is a direct legacy of the plague. A society more acutely aware of mortality and human fragility begins to value the tangible, the observable, the real. Literature, too, bears the imprint of the plague. Works like Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron are not merely stories, they are coping mechanisms, imaginative escapes, and social commentaries. In the Decameron, 10 young people flee plague-ridden Florence to a villa in the countryside, passing the time by telling stories. Some are humorous, some tragic, some bawdy, but all reflect the human need to create meaning, to find connection, to laugh and cry even in the shadow of death. You can imagine these stories being told to calm the nerves, to reassure listeners that life, though fragile, continues. The Black Death also accelerates scientific observation. Physicians begin keeping records, noting patterns of disease and mortality. City governments start to maintain mortality rolls, tracking who dies and where. Though they do not yet understand bacteria or contagion in modern terms, the habit of observation, data collection, and pattern recognition begins to take root. The plague becomes, in a sense, the first real catalyst for epidemiology, a discipline that will not fully emerge for centuries, but whose seeds are planted here. You can picture a clerk in Florence, tallying deaths in a ledger, unaware that his work will one day inform public health policy around the world. Medicine itself evolves, though slowly. The failures of traditional remedies, bloodletting, poultices, and charms force people to notice what does not work. Isolation, quarantine, and sanitation, though rudimentary, prove somewhat effective. Venice's lazarettos, Florence's pest houses, and other forms of early public health interventions lay the groundwork for a scientific approach to disease management. The lesson is clear. Observation and practical measures, even when imperfect, can save lives. The Black Death teaches humanity, painfully, that knowledge is power, and that ignoring reality has dire consequences. Politically, the plague has lasting effects as well. Kings and princes confront shortages of labor and resources, prompting changes in taxation, military recruitment, and governance. Serfs and peasants gain leverage, and some rebellions occur, most famously England's Peasants' Revolt in 1381. Though suppressed, these uprisings signal the beginning of a long-term decline in feudal obligations and the rise of a society with more personal freedom and mobility. For you living in that era, it is a time of uncertainty, yes, but also a time when ordinary people begin to imagine possibilities that were previously inconceivable. Culturally, the plague reshapes human priorities. People who have seen the fragility of life are more willing to invest in personal comfort, education, and artistic expression. Wealth is no longer hoarded in the same way. It is spent, circulated, and used to create beauty, infrastructure, and knowledge. Urban centers grow, trade routes expand, universities flourish. The seeds of modern Europe, Its cities, economies, and intellectual life are all influenced directly or indirectly by the demographic shock of the Black Death. The psychological impact of surviving such a catastrophe is also profound. The concept of mortality becomes immediate, not abstract. Families are smaller, communities tighter. Life is lived more intensely. Birth and death, love and loss, work and leisure, everything is heightened because the fragility of existence is palpable. You can almost feel the heartbeat of a society learning, painfully, that every day is precious and every person is irreplaceable. Interestingly, the plague's legacy even shapes religious thought. The church is shaken by the loss of clergy and the failure to protect the faithful. New movements, sometimes radical, emerge. Lay people take more responsibility for charitable work. Confraternities grow, emphasizing community care, education, and relief for the poor and sick. Skepticism begins to creep in, laying early groundwork for later reforms and questioning of religious authority. You can see that humanity, faced with inexplicable suffering, adapts by adjusting its moral and spiritual frameworks. The Black Death also teaches lessons about resilience and adaptation. Those who survive must rebuild not just physically, but socially and emotionally. Towns are reconstructed, economies revived, families replanted. Traditions shift to accommodate the new reality. Practices that seem ordinary to you today, like quarantines, record keeping, and medical observation, have roots in the desperate adaptations made during these plague years. It is as if the catastrophe, while brutal, forced humanity to invent systems that would help it endure future challenges. There are, of course, darker lessons as well. Fear can lead to cruelty, scapegoating, and violence. Jewish communities are massacred. Strangers and marginalized groups are accused of spreading disease. Communities fracture under stress. The plague illustrates how easily fear can distort morality and provoke persecution. Yet, in surviving these horrors, societies also learn the importance of law, governance, and social cohesion, the frameworks that will allow recovery and eventual prosperity. And finally, the Black Death resonates even in modern times. When we confront pandemics today, smallpox, influenza, coronavirus, we see echoes of the past, fear of the unknown, debates about quarantine, the search for cures, and the profound social and economic disruptions that follow. History becomes not merely a record of human suffering, but a guide, a warning, and sometimes a reassurance. The world survived the Black Death. Humanity learned, societies adapted, and while each epidemic is unique, the lessons of 14th century Europe remind us that even in catastrophe, resilience, ingenuity, and care can sustain us. So as you sit here, reflecting on the centuries of history shaped by a single disease, consider the strange legacy it leaves. Millions died, families were wiped out, communities vanished. But from the ashes, the foundations of modern Europe were laid. Art, science, social structures, economic systems, and human psychology were all transformed. What seems at first like pure destruction is also the crucible in which the next world is forged. If you imagine walking through the streets of Florence or London a century after the first wave, you see people learning, rebuilding, creating. Children play in streets that once rang with the cries of the dying. Markets thrive, schools open, cathedrals soar once more, and the memory of what was lost guides the choices of the living. There is grief, yes, but also hope, the stubborn, persistent hope that humanity endures. In a way, the Black Death becomes not just a story of mortality, but a story of human persistence, adaptability, and imagination. It teaches that even when systems fail, When death seems inevitable, life continues. People survive, societies adjust, knowledge accumulates, and civilization moves forward. The past, though dark, becomes a foundation for the future. And so, as you listen here, in the quiet of your room, perhaps in the comfort of your own life, think about this. The Black Death shaped the world you inhabit. The streets, the buildings, the schools, the hospitals, the very idea that society can respond to crisis. These are all shadows of what happened in those terrifying years. The past is not gone. It echoes, in subtle ways, in every corner of modern life. Would you have survived? Would you have adapted, fled, prayed, fought, or endured? Could you have rebuilt from nothing, as those who lived after the plague did? The Black Death leaves us with these questions, unanswered yet vital, a reminder of both the fragility and the resilience of human life. The story ends, for now, not with closure, but with reflection. You are alive to hear it, centuries later. The Black Death remains both a warning and a lesson. Devastation can lead to renewal. Death can bring transformation, and even in the darkest times, humanity finds ways to endure, to adapt, and to hope.